Canada is facing a crisis of people leaving the country, which nobody is talking about, and could be the biggest crisis the country has ever faced because of the cost of living. And this really doesn't get any better because more and more stories are now being picked up about people who are leaving Canada right now. And just think about it, guys. We're not even at the point where people are losing jobs and there's a massive amount of unemployment. I think that is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And you are just going to have a massive amount of people leaving the country, because when you have high immigration, guess what? That also means you've got to deal with high emigration, possibly, if the economy goes sour, as those people you bring in have less ties to the country, less of a Canada's recent decision to raise its key interest rate and the average price of a home rising year over year, many Canadians say they are struggling to afford housing. As a result, some have decided to relocate to countries where they will pay less for accommodation and other essential items. And just think about this, guys. Most people who can leave will leave. That is just a fact, because the cost of living has just got so insane. And the Canadian government a couple of weeks ago just came out with its digital nomad visa. I mean, what digital nomad is going to want to come to Canada? I mean, digital nomads generally seek out places with a lower cost of living and a good lifestyle. You don't have that balance in Canada at all. And this is just one of the many problems that exists. And it's not just home prices, it's also the cost of rent. So you've broken the housing market, you've broken the rental market. And once you break that labor market, you're gonna find it very hard to sellotate this thing back together. And yes, of course, as I've said before, there is an unlimited amount of poor people, refugees, and asylum seekers willing to come over if they want to fill their targets with those. And that will lead to a collapse of society and public services, which we are sort of seeing already, because refugees and asylum seekers, the amount of people coming since 2010 has gone up by over 100%, whereas skilled immigration has gone down. So it's kind of crazy. So anyway, one of those people is Roland Cameron from Hamilton, Ontario. Cameron and his wife arrived in Barbados on July 10th and planned to live there permanently. The couple had considered living in other countries before settling on Barbados, where Cameron's father's side of the family lives. In a search of a lower cost of living, the couples hope to make the value of their dollar go further. And you know, obviously in Barbados, there's massive tax advantages as well. But in the case of this guy as well, he's also got a support network there, which is worth mentioning, because that is quite often why immigrants move back to their own countries, is because of recession, cost of living crisis, whatever it is. And I've said before, people in Canada are hanging on by a thread right now, especially immigrants. Like, one thing breaks and there's just going to be so many people leaving. And you could just imagine the impact that will have on the economy, because all the people that do the low wage jobs that people don't want to do in Canada are immigrants. You would see inflation skyrocket and services absolutely collapse. Doctors, nurses, so many different things have been priced out, and we've already seen this dynamic actually playing out within Canada. Doctors leaving certain expensive areas in BC where they can't even afford a home. So this is only going to get worse. And as soon as people start to leave the country, oh my God, it is really going to get bad. Maybe this is what the yield curve is predicting, and you know, the housing market would come second to such a bubble bursting as the immigration one. Cameron is one of several people who wrote to CTV News about settling outside of Canada due to the high cost of living. Notice, it's always high cost of living. It's the high cost of housing. You're seeing a running theme with this because there's a housing bubble that's been built up in Canada, and it's now deterring people from moving here. And not only that, the ones that can leave are leaving. So you've got a brain drain that's happening. So it's kind of insane. That doesn't mean they can't fill the targets, like I said, but it's just what disaster like what sort of what's it going to be like in that scenario when you're pulling in just constantly more and more people that are depending on services that you don't have, that you have to print money to maintain. So it's just absolutely disastrous in my opinion. So, although data from Statistics Canada shows there are more people immigrating to the country than there are emigrating, Canadians such as Cameron are permanently leaving the country every day. Statistics show that one emigrant will leave Canada every 20 minutes or so. And you have to remember as well that they don't know. They don't really know how many people are leaving, because if they don't actually declare themselves as leaving, which a lot of people don't do because of the exit taxes that are in place, so they don't bother to actually declare that they've left, they're still counted as living in Canada, because one of the metrics Statistics Canada uses is the tax system to see whether people are actually resident in Canada or not. A lot of people are actually breaking the law when they leave Canada and actually owe taxes back in Canada without realizing it, because they didn't make the necessary, they didn't put the necessary things in place when they left. They didn't do the correct procedures that the Canadian government wants you to do, because there's even red tape when you want to leave the country. That is how insane this country really is with red tape. So high housing costs play a key role in Cameron and his wife's decision to leave Canada. He said for his 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in Ontario, Cameron's monthly mortgage payment was about $5,500, he said. But in Barbados, Cameron is renting a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom home in St. Philip for slightly more than $3,000 a month. The house spans 2,300 square feet and includes a pool. So he is living a really nice lifestyle there. And you've got to think as well, he's probably selling his home at a higher price and he can just sell it. So what happens if a load of immigrants want to leave because they've lost their job and they're trying to sell their homes? I mean, you know, this whole thing is stacked like a house of cards. The entire economy in Canada. I'm telling you, a lot of people will say, yeah, good riddance to those immigrants. But honestly, you don't realize how much the economy in Canada depends on those immigrants because of the birth rate that is absolutely collapsed. And that has happened because the government doesn't look after its own citizens and is completely fucked up over the past couple of decades. Conservatives, Liberals, NDP, all of them. So it's kind of mad. And then another story here. So the difference between surviving and living. This is just kind of crazy. The 45-year-old veteran receives military and disability pensions following his medical release from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2020. This money was barely enough to afford his monthly expenses whilst living in Canada. That's how well they look after ex-military in Canada. He said after visiting Mexico, the Philippines, and Alberta, Thurrott and his wife plan to move to Cambodia, where the cost of living is far more affordable compared to Canada, he said. Starting in August, Thurrott and his wife will live in a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom home with a pool while paying $300 a month in rent, he said. Meanwhile, in Canada, the average price to rent a 1-bedroom unit is $1,837 a month. So it is kind of nuts when you really think about it. And this is just going to continue, and it's going to get much worse in a recession. That's what I'm trying to outline here. Everybody who's got a brain is trying to get out. They see the writing on the wall. And even if you love Canada, I absolutely love Canada, and I hope this country changes, but I realized that I have to leave in order to better myself. And that's just kind of crazy that you have to do that. And it makes me angry, you know, because I believe Canada has so much potential as a country, and I've seen it decline in living standards so much since I came here and started visiting here in 2011. It's just kind of crazy and sad to me. And maybe, hopefully, in the future, I really, really hope it gets back to being a place that is of lower cost of living. But that's not going to happen without pain, I don't think, as you can also imagine as well, and as we are seeing. So that is just crazy. They're off to Cambodia. And then there's another story here. So father of 2 no longer sees Canada as the end goal. Shane Biatz, who grew up near London, Ontario, began working in the Philippines in 2011 About a decade later, during the pandemic, he returned to Canada with his wife and 2 children. He had been laid off at the time, and his family was considering permanently relocating to Canada, he said. But as his family looked for a home, they saw average prices were rapidly rising. By February 2022, the national average price of a home peaked at $816,000, according to the Canadian Real Estate Association. Looking at rising home prices in London, Ontario, and the Greater Toronto area, Biatz said he didn't know if it made financial sense for his family to stay in Canada. Houses were going up like hundreds of thousands of dollars within months. The 48-year-old told CTV News by a telephone interview. It was shocking. So it's kind of crazy. And his story is just exactly the same, right? Rising rent, rising housing prices. This is the main cost of living and the main cause of concern. And, it's like I said, people are hanging on by a thread. Of course, landlords can charge more for rent, but if they're charging somebody 50% of their income and then one person in the household loses their job, they're not going to be able to meet those obligations. And you can just see the massive problems that are coming. And in a credit-based economy which is crumbling right now, the foundation is crumbling. It's just a total disaster that I see on the horizon. I just see a massive exodus from Canada of all these people, including Canadians, who are just going to leave if they can and have the capacity to leave. And that's already happening to a large extent. And we've seen a boom in it. That is why we have massive labor shortages, but nobody dares talk about it. But that is the utter truth, is why do we have these labor shortages if we have this massive amount of skilled immigration that we're led to believe? I mean, a lot of these jobs are well-paying jobs too. So it's not like you can say, oh, Luke, they don't pay well enough. No, these are the jobs that pay well, and we don't have anybody here to fill them. It's because the skilled immigrants that can do those jobs are going elsewhere. They're going to countries that pay them more, have a lower cost of living, better lifestyle, better weather, and Canada is just becoming a magnet for the type of people that a country really struggles with during times like this, which depend more on public services. So it is kind of crazy. And so Biatz was also worried about whether his daughters aged 9 and 12 would eventually be able to afford homes themselves. He said, although the average national price of a home has dropped since February 2022, CREA data shows an annual increase between June 2022 and June 2023. And then he said, I always felt like my daughters were going to have a better life in Canada, but I wasn't seeing that anymore, he said. It's sad to no longer perceive Canada as an end goal. And I totally agree with him. I totally agree with him. As an immigrant myself, that is how I see it as well. I'm very, very sad to say that. And I think Canada has so much potential, like I said. But, it is a crony capitalist country that is operated by an oligarchy of different companies that basically control the price of everything in Canada. And it just leads to this massively inflationary crisis that we have right now that will just continue. And a lot of these big, large companies have been the ones that have been lobbying for more and more immigration, because those are the people that are employing those low-skilled workers and paying them not much money. And then they'll go live in a house with 10, 20 people in one single family home. And to them, the living standards might be better than they were back home, depending on where they come from. But for everybody else who's seen the better side of Canada and knows the better side of Canada, they're seeing their living standards drop massively. And this is just causing a massive crisis, like I said. And it just cannot continue this way, where you've got things moving in the opposite direction. So kind of crazy, but I totally agree with this guy. So rising home prices ultimately led Biatz and his family to return to the Philippines in March 2022. He said they now rent a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom condominium in Manila for about $4,000 a month. Wow, that's expensive for Philippines. But maybe it's just Manila, but Philippines is not expensive at all. $4,000 a month is a lot. That must be one hell of an apartment. Although leaving Canada has made it difficult to spend time with his relatives, Biatz plans to continue living in the Philippines with his wife and daughters. He said he is able to provide them with greater financial stability and a better quality of life. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could get paid way less and live in a country like the Philippines, and you would have a better life than you would in Canada, because if you're spending 40-50% of your income on rent, you know, and you can take your rent down by 20-30%, you can afford to take a hit with your average income. So it is nuts what's going on with this. I feel like this is such a big crisis that's brewing. And now I'm going to leave a link in the description for this. And this just basically shows, it's the population clock. It's quite interesting because you can see how many people are being born, dying, immigrants, emigrants, non-permanent residents, and interprovincial migrants. I'd just say that obviously the emigrants, they're the most inaccurate because they don't really know. And that is really to do with Canada's exit tax. If they got rid of the exit tax, then they'd probably have a more realistic number on the amount of people leaving. But they really don't have a clue. But I think it's kind of obvious to us, because if you go to any of these places that expats are flooding to, there's a hell of a lot of Canadians there. And it's because of the cost of living. There's really nowhere left to go in Canada. And then you can look at this report as well. I'll just leave it in the description. It's quite esoteric, but it just shows the models of how they measure people leaving Canada. And it's really not that great. And then obviously you've got this happening as well. It was happening last week. And basically it's the amount of refugees that are coming in is just beginning to show. But this has been a theme for a long time. People think this is just a new thing, but refugees on the streets in Canada has been a thing for a while now, and I'll show you in a minute that that's the case. I don't know why now it is being brought to the forefront. Maybe it's a distraction, I don't know. But then it does show that they're providing another $210 million to provide interim housing. So this is things like hotels. So they'll pay for hotel rooms for these refugees. And, you know, it is just kind of nuts. But obviously, this is money that is being printed up to do this, because the government is essentially bankrupt and they're deficit spending. So any new money that comes into existence is just printed cash. So I just think this is a recipe for disaster. I don't think that Canada shouldn't take refugees and asylum seekers, obviously every country, but obviously they have to put protections in place to safeguard public services and different things like that, because there is a tendency, not with all of the people, I want to make that clear, but there is a tendency that a lot of the refugees and asylum seekers are coming for the benefit systems in different countries. And I've seen that happening in the UK to a massive extent. It happens in the UK, and the benefit systems are abused there. And now you have the UK essentially collapsing because it can't afford to uphold all these benefit systems. And then, contrary to popular belief, Canada does not treat refugees well at all. On June 1st, the cash-strapped city of Toronto began diverting refugee claimants away from its overrun city shelters to federal programs that reserve 500 shelter beds each night for refugee claimants. But after arriving at the shelter intake site, the refugees quickly found that the shelter they were promised through said programs were non-existent. It was far too over capacity. So dozens of newly arrived asylum seekers and their families have been camping out on the sidewalk ever since. And something that is never discussed either is the fact that a lot of these are bussed down from Roxham Road from Quebec, because Quebec doesn't want them, and they're bussed right down to Ontario and Toronto. How on earth does this happen? But Quebec just does what it wants. It kind of acts like an independent country within Canada with all the benefits of being part of the Federation. It's absolutely nuts, but there's obviously a long history there that I won't go into. And then, you know, there's an estimated between 150,000 and 300,000 homeless in Canada right now. So you've got that amount of homeless people. You're taking in refugees. You can't even look after your own people. You know, it's just a joke that Canada is like like, yeah, we're going to take in more refugees. Let's take in 100% more refugees like they've done since 2010. But we can't look after our own. We can't look after our own people. And the crux of why that is the same reason as people are leaving the country. And, 2019, same thing was happening. Refugees and asylum claimants ending up on the streets. All these links will be in the description. Check out this. I can't talk about this story, but check it out. And then obviously you've got the rising home prices. So rising home prices right now, kind of crazy. But look at what has happened since 2010 to housing prices. You've gone from an average price of $473,000 for a single family home in Toronto to over 1.4 million. Just think about that, guys. And that obviously does not help the homelessness situation in these different cities. And the rising cost of living doesn't help either. All these things are pushing more and more people into poverty and more people onto the streets. And then you're taking in refugees. You can't even look after your own. It's so stupid. And you're just going to see more crime on the streets because these people are going to have to do whatever it takes in order to live, in order to get by. And eventually they're going to resort to crime. That's what the homeless people in Canada do as well. There's a lot of random attacks, random stabbings, people getting mugged, burgled, because these people are just trying to provide for themselves. And, in some ways, they've been left behind by the system because Canada doesn't care about them. It's more focused on the refugees and asylum seekers because that is the virtue signaling that the Canadian government loves to do. So it's absolutely insane. But the crux of it is a housing bubble has caused all these different things. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in Canada over the next decade. It could be a pivotal moment in Canadian history that I think will be talked about for hundreds of years after this, to be quite honest, because yeah, a lot of things come into head all at once. So anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, you might like this video here. You might also like that video there. I will see you in the next one.